Welcome to TLV Talk. We're so glad to have you. Today, we're going to be talking about Passover and Easter and how they relate together and how the origins of Easter are actually in Passover. Come study the Bible with us. Welcome back. Hey, Mandie, how you doing?
Hey, Joe, how are you doing?
I'm doing all right. I'm doing all right.
Super happy to be here. I am here because mom's a little under the weather,
Yep.
but we're super excited to be able to have this chat
Mm-hmm.
because you and I have been talking about this stuff for years. And with both of us having gone to seminary and been in seminary classes, we often have some of the same classes and some of the same coursework. And I'm really super excited to be able to share this with our audience today.
All right. So the conversation about Easter and Passover, simply put, the origins of Easter exist with Passover inside it, right? So,
Yeah.
Passover's coming. Passover. Well, we're in the middle of Passover, and Easter is coming up. And the big thing about Easter is it's always the same date on the calendar,
Yeah.
where Passover actually shifts and changes because it's on a lunar calendar.
Absolutely.
Right? So what I've always found over the years is, Passover can be relevant to your average Christian if it's around Easter. But if it's like got a large amount of time
Yeah, like
between,
7 to 10 days. There's
right?
sometimes a huge disparity
Mhm.
between Passover
Mhm.
and Easter. And, in our experience, we've seen it come 2 weeks before Easter or
Mhm.
2 weeks after Easter.
Exactly. So what I found is that people who are getting into the Jewish roots of things, they love getting a chance to celebrate Passover, but it doesn't always have a lot of relevance if it's like 2 weeks after Easter,
Yeah,
right?
it can seem a little anticlimactic.
So I think in some ways, the idea of Easter and how it's related to Passover really kind of is all about kind of the early centuries of Christianity and Judaism, right? So, you have, Jesus, Yeshua in 33,
Hmm.
right? And then you have the temple destruction in 70. And then by the early centuries, we're starting to see, me and mom have talked about this parting of the ways
Yeah, with the
between.
councils of Nicaea and
Mhm,
Laodicea. Yeah,
mhm, mhm.
absolutely.
And so I'd like to get into that today because I think that the more I dug into it, because I didn't grow up celebrating Easter at all. That wasn't really a thing, right? We went to synagogue, we did Passover, but I've attended a couple of services.
Yeah.
So
And I
it's.
went to a lot more, like a lot of my friends were in Christian high schools
Mhm,
and in private schools.
mhm,
So when I was growing up, and I'm only a few years older than you, when I was growing up, I actually went with a lot of my friends to their
mhm,
Easter services and their Easter egg
mhm,
hunts and Palm Sundays. And,
mhm,
you and I went to Christian school,
mhm,
but we were in Christian private school mostly
mhm,
for our elementary days.
mhm,
And I went to high school in a Christian private school for a little bit.
mhm,
And so I got to experience what the more adult version of Easter was
mhm,
in those years. So,
yeah.
yeah, I mean, but we mostly grew up celebrating Passover.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that in some ways, we're at a bit of a disadvantage in terms of how people celebrate Easter
Hmm.
today, other than, you have your normal Easter morning service, you have a Palm Sunday service, there's Good Friday.
Yeah.
So there's all these kind of things where, it really kind of only was relevant to us when it was around Passover, right? Because
Yeah.
then people would care. It's sort of like the same thing, like when you have Hanukkah and Christmas, and
Chrismica.
if Hanukkah's near Christmas, everybody cares, but if it's like a whole month, they're like, we're over it,
Yeah. Well, it's
So.
all about maximizing your present to day ratio
Mhm,
for that kind of thing. I,
mhm,
I know that our kids are very into the overlap
right.
of Hanukkah and
Well,
Christmas.
to me, I think really the critical component between the relation between Passover and Easter is the simple concept of timing,
Yeah,
right? And it's all about the solar versus lunar calendar,
absolutely. Yeah.
right? So you have, Passover is 14 days after the new moon. It's on the
Mhm.
full moon, and it's right after the biblical New Year that
Yeah.
I've talked with Mom about a lot, and but that is not the same with Easter, which is
Mhm.
usually after the spring equinox,
Yeah.
and so it's always consistent.
Yeah.
So what I think the main difference is really timing and the date, and that's kind of where, in my opinion, all of this kind of starts to diverge in the
Mhm.
early centuries.
Well,
Um,
wasn't it because the Gregorian calendar was adopted by the Roman Empire
mhm,
and the Jewish people still
mhm,
maintained their Hebrew calendar according to
mhm,
Torah? So when you
exactly.
have this divergence between, at first in the early church, it goes, well, what are we going to do with all these Gentiles?
Mhm,
And then the Roman Empire takes on, Christianity as
mhm,
its mainstay. Then you have this,
mhm,
well, we don't want to have anything to do with the Jews because we want them to be separate. So you
mhm.
have this huge divergence between the calendars
Right.
in, that 150 to 350 AD
Oh yeah,
type of
all
thing.
everything we're talking about is basically from 100 to about 400 AD,
Hmm.
right? The first to fourth centuries, right?
Somewhere in
Um,
there, yeah.
and so the idea is that we start seeing this from my research. What I found out was something called the quarter deciman controversy, or
Hmm.
quarter decimans, and these were people that still, and this was in the early to late, well, they were in the hundreds,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Not even 100 years after the temple destruction, so it's pretty recent in
Yeah, I
terms
mean, in
of
terms of
Jewish believers.
yeah.
And so these were people, they're called quarter decimans because it comes from the Latin quarter decimum, which is 14th,
Mhm.
right? Which is essentially the 14th of Nisan,
Oh,
right? So
okay.
these were people that felt it was important to celebrate the resurrection, because really, not only is timing a major difference between Passover and Easter,
Mhm.
I also think in some ways there's a major difference in significance, because you've got Passover that really focuses on the sacrificial lamb.
Yeah,
Me and Mom, we did the Passover lamb podcast, and
I
we got
watched it. It
we
was
got
awesome.
all into
It was
that,
super cool.
like, Bible biblical study part of it,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
right? But interestingly enough, Easter is in some ways more focused on the resurrection,
Absolutely.
right? So I feel like it's not just a separation in timing, but it's a separation in what are we celebrating,
Yeah.
right? So for us, especially as Jewish believers, we see Passover as Messiah Yeshua being the sacrificial lamb,
Mhm.
and the his death and his sacrifice being covering the sins of the world, right?
Absolutely.
But in terms of the resurrection, although we
Mhm.
have a little bit of that with the Afikomen and the Passover Seder,
But that's, like, not even that was added later
right?
into the
Exactly.
Seder. That
But
wasn't
even
even
mainstream Jews don't see that as
yeah.
a resurrection concept, right? We kind of apply that, um, but the
They see it as a redemption concept,
mhm,
but not a resurrection concept.
exactly. So interestingly enough, I find that timing and what you're observing is really the main differences between
Mhm.
Passover and Easter. And you can, I guess I would say, overlay them,
Mhm.
right? Where they hold more significance together, because obviously we believe in the death and the resurrection.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so we always try to allude to it during Passover Seders. But interestingly enough, Easter has very little to do with as much the sacrifice
Mhm.
as it is his resurrection, right? It's always
Yeah.
like he's
Yeah.
alive, right? There's an empty tomb. These
Yeah,
are
the
the
whole "he is risen, he is
exactly.
alive," and I think that's a really interesting divergence in the foci of
Hmm.
these two holidays that are incredibly intertwined.
They basically are,
They
because
they really are, and you have to pay attention to both sides of the coin. You
mhm,
can't have one without the other because you can't have the power of the resurrection without the initiation of the sacrifice, and the sacrifice doesn't mean anything unless you have the resurrection.
mhm,
So with it kind of feels like in this great divorce, quote
Mhm.
unquote, between Judaism and Christianity, that one side of the family got one end of the celebration and the other side of the family got the other
Mhm.
end.
Mhm.
And I think that as Messianic Jews, we can we can kind of overlook how significant it
Mhm.
is to have the coming together of these two holidays and celebrating them together, because I know we've celebrated the resurrection after we've
Mhm.
celebrated Passover
Mhm.
during the first fruits festival, which is called Bikurim.
Mhm.
And we tend to do a resurrection celebration as Messianic Jews in
Mhm.
our synagogues
Right.
around Bikurim.
Yeah, that's kind of in some ways, first fruits is how we in Messianic Judaism kind of celebrate that
Hmm.
resurrection concept. I think for me, I found it interesting that according to history, it's just a clear separation.
Oh,
And
absolutely.
you see this even in like the hundreds with this quarter controversy that, the early bishops, the church fathers, they wanted to celebrate it along with the Jews
Hmm.
during the 14th of Nisan, right? They wanted to do it
Yeah.
for Passover. And you had other bishops that said, "No, we're not supposed to be following any Jewish,
Yeah, we've done away with
traditions,
it.
and so we want to do it. We want a standardization."
Mhm,
So what I see is in an effort to standardize,
mhm.
right? Early Christianity basically the standardization also encourages a clear, like you said, divorce
Mhm.
from anything Jewish,
Yeah.
right? And in the early, like in the hundreds, they kind of decide to just say, I disagree with
Agree to
you,
disagree.
agree to disagree, and so they kind of parted ways. There wasn't any really formal thing,
Yeah, there
but
was.
it was the inklings that people were feeling differently
Yeah.
about how to celebrate Easter, when to celebrate it, and then it really shouldn't be attached.
Yeah.
And so what you see is people have a different interpretation of honoring the Lord and what He's commanded,
Well,
right?
that's exactly what happens with all of our church denominations. It's what
Hmm.
happens when you have different sects,
Hmm.
breaking off. And Judaism has had its variation of sects
Hmm.
throughout all of history. And it's really seen in the New Testament with the Pharisees, Sadducees,
Hmm.
Essenes,
Hmm.
and you have all of these little sects, all these little pockets
Hmm.
of people who believe different things.
Right.
And when, in the search for legitimizing
Hmm.
Christianity
Hmm.
and making it standard, as you said,
Hmm.
there really was this huge effort to kind of set it apart and make sure that everybody was on the same page.
Hmm.
And that's kind of impossible
Hmm.
when you are looking at all of the variations in culture, the variations
Hmm.
in location. You can't expect someone to be exactly the same as someone in, the Turkish area to be the same as someone in a European area, as when or the difference between the Greeks and the Romans. There are so many little ways that these denominations and these branches split
Hmm.
off.
Yeah.
And so it's
Well.
just kind of crazy that we still deal with that even to today
Mhm.
in terms of standardization of how you're supposed to quote unquote worship the
Yeah,
Lord.
it's you find often biblical interpretation and how to observe things is always a good question,
Oh yeah,
whether it's in Judaism or Christianity.
for
But
sure.
what I will say is, you're absolutely right. By the time the Council of Nicaea happens, we see this kind of real true cutoff,
Mhm.
right? Where they say, we're going to celebrate Easter. That's really where the decision is made.
Yeah.
So you see the inklings of it in the early hundreds,
Yeah.
but by the Council of Nicaea in, I believe it's 325,
Yeah.
um, you see this clear delineation. We don't do it the way the Jews do, and a real decision, an intentional decision to say we're not going to celebrate Christian holidays on
Jewish
the
ones.
Jewish calendar.
Yeah.
And so when how are you supposed to agree if you aren't even on the same timetable,
Mhm.
right? If you use a different metric than your friend or family,
Mhm.
then you'll never end up meeting and having a connection.
Hey, I am so excited about the TLV Bible app. This is a dream come true for us. We've been planning this for over a decade, and now we have a biblical lifestyle app. And you can get involved in knowing when the biblical holidays are, starting your day off with a proverb, watching the podcast. Sharing this TLV Bible app with a friend can strengthen their relationship with God, where they're hearing from God, from the Word every day for their life. That's the whole goal of having a biblical lifestyle. So please download the Bible app and share it with a friend today. And let's get this world back on track to biblical values and biblical living. It's the best way to draw close to God.
Well, that is why perspective matters so much. And one of the things that I know we've made an effort to do is to put the Jewish perspective back into the New Testament. And that's why our art is from the perspective of Yeshua himself.
Mhm.
I mean, as we were talking about, celebrating two sides of Passover and Easter, I was really reminded about how selective we were about the imagery that we use, because there's so much
Mhm.
imagery surrounding the resurrection
Mhm.
and the ascension and all of
Mhm.
these things. And I mean, as you and I have spoken about it a zillion times,
Mhm.
the way that the church really expressed and made the lessons of the New Testament known was through art and through sculpture and
Mhm.
through all of these things. And so, because most people couldn't read and no one had their Bibles back in the day, you had to go to to the quote unquote bishops. You had to go to the leaders of the community, and so art was a huge part of it. And that's why we included art in the Bible that we made.
Mhm.
And so one of the things that we did is that we made the crucifixion and the ascension both from the perspective of Yeshua himself,
Mhm.
because we wanted to show that it was the same story from the same person. Like, it's not like the Jesus who died on the cross is different from the Jesus who ascended into heaven. We believe that, Yeshua died and
Mhm.
rose again and is seated at the right hand of God. And so that's one of the things that we are very, very conscientious of. And I think that a lot of the imagery between the Passover lamb being slain and the rising again, there's color themes, and even and I did some study on this. There's even like different colors that churches use to associate like the death and the tomb and the resurrection and the ascension throughout the process of gearing up for Easter. And I think that's such an interesting way to portray their celebration. And we certainly don't, you know, associate a certain color with Passover other than, the blood of the lamb. So, can you tell me what it was about this divergence between Nicaea and this divergence between choosing not to pay attention to the lunar calendar, even though the lunar calendar is like pretty standard across a lot of civilizations, since a
Mhm.
lot of people can just look up at the moon and know what time in the month it is. How did that
Well, it's
unfold?
the only way you can, in my opinion, it's the lunar calendar is the only way that you can determine time without advanced instrumentation, right?
Very well said.
So the reality is like if you're just an average person, the way you can tell time is by by the moon, the passage of time. You can't tell the passage of time by the sun except daily.
Yeah.
So the sun is really only daily, from somebody who doesn't have a way to look up in the sky or have an advanced instrument. And so if you're talking about the average farmer or average, layman back, I don't know, ancient times, even Middle Ages, the fact is when education is low, everybody can look up at the moon and go, yeah, it's that time of the month,
Yeah.
right? So I think that there's some advantages to a lunar calendar in terms of making it accessible to the average person,
Hmm.
right? It's clearly not as accurate. I don't think anybody delineates that, but you know, in terms, that's always the question. I think we deal with that even in translation, accuracy versus readability,
Yeah, for
right? This
sure.
idea that it's only as helpful as people's ability to read it, but
Absolutely.
if it's so readable that it basically strays from what's being said, then it's completely inaccurate.
Yeah.
So there's a balance, I think, that you could connect both biblical translation to and keeping time,
Hmm.
right? But in terms of the kind of the, I guess I call it the parting of the ways, just because
Oh, that's a really good way to
that's what
say it.
that's what I learned when I was doing the seminary class. And it's always fascinated me because um we grew up with lots of Christian friends. Our parents were friends with pastors.
Absolutely.
We visited church services. Like, to me, there's one kingdom.
Hmm.
So more often what we see is really a divergence of culture,
Yeah,
right? But this culture that we have today is due to intentional decisions in the past.
absolutely.
So
And they've been in place for thousands of years now.
exactly, exactly. So, to me, yes, there's aspects to modern day Easter that uh, has paganism in it,
Hmm.
right? And that's bound to happen,
Yeah.
right? Over time,
As you're
people,
incorporating more
right?
cultures, as you're having
Exactly.
more immigrants.
So,
Yeah, absolutely.
I think it's pretty common knowledge that, Easter, the term Easter is used from a um, like a spring goddess name
Hmm.
back in the day. But what I found was interesting is it was actually added much later. The
Hmm.
term Easter, um,
That's
and then it's
fascinating.
from like I would say like 1700s and on, based
Oh,
on Anglo-Saxon
yeah.
etymology, right? So I found that interesting. And when I looked into it, what I found was in the Greek New Testament, when we say Pesach, which is the Hebrew for lamb,
Hmm.
and usually what we use as Passover,
Yeah.
right? It's the same terminology,
Yeah. The
right?
Moed, the appointed feast of
Right.
Pesach, of the
Exactly.
lamb.
What I found interesting was the etymology of that into other languages,
Hmm.
and that in the Greek Septuagint, they use Pascha,
Oh,
right?
okay.
Which is the same thing for Passover. So it's interchangeable.
Oh, cool.
And in some languages across the globe, they don't actually use the term Easter. They use some derivative of Pascha, right?
Oh,
So there's variation,
that's
but
really
even
cool.
in Spanish, Italian,
All the Romance
French,
languages.
Russian, Coptic, all these. The interesting thing is all these languages, um, and even in modern day Greek, they'll use it too, and they use the term Paschal, like uh, traditions, or so this idea that the Passover lamb has kind of found a way to ride through language over time,
Hmm.
even though the celebration of Easter is very different than it was,
Yeah.
right? But the origins of Passover inside Easter are found even in
That's
the
amazing.
languages of today. And I thought that was,
That
to
is
me,
spectacular.
I thought that was really cool,
That's so
because
cool.
if that's in the Greek Septuagint, right, the New Testament translation, and then it's also used in multiple languages, Portuguese,
Hmm.
Spanish, Pasqua, like it's these variations, but it all comes from that derivative word from Aramaic. So it came from Pesach to Pascha in Aramaic, and then it kind of just flowed through
Through
all the
the
other
Greek and
languages.
then into the Romance
Exactly.
languages. Yeah, the thing that's crazy is that if you look at linguistically, like the different trees, Anglo-Saxon is in a completely different
Mhm.
tree than the
Exactly.
rest of the languages,
Right.
like Greek and all of its
Right. Right,
subsequent
and even
variations.
Easter, in my opinion, has brought a lot of that stuff with it over time,
Yeah.
and it comes from those Anglo-Saxon traditions and culture, and so, the Easter of today would be very different than them celebrating it in the early centuries,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah,
They would have,
absolutely.
like, especially in the, hundreds and 200s,
Hmm.
they would have been connecting the Passover lamb with Easter,
Yeah.
right? That would have been a normal idea.
Well, the whole thing about Palm Sunday was because the palm branches were
Mhm.
waved when Yeshua was entering into Jerusalem.
Hmm.
So you have this, this
Hmm.
welcoming of Messiah for Palm Sunday.
Hmm.
And then a week later, you
Hmm.
have the celebration of Easter and
Right.
Good Friday in between,
Hmm.
even though Good Friday is supposed to be associated with the day that Yeshua was sacrificed on the tree.
Exactly.
So
There's a lot of
it's a
back and
lot of back
forth,
and forth.
and I don't want to give the impression that there hasn't been some influence the other way.
Hmm.
Because if you look at the modern Seder plate, right?
Absolutely.
Just by itself, it has, 6 ingredients to it. And,
Hmm.
we did the Passover Seder, or we said it was celebrate Passover, but we basically did a Seder
Yeah.
on the podcast a few, podcasts ago. And we talked about that you really only need lamb, bitter herbs, and matzah.
Yep.
But the average, let's say, not even Jewish believer, let's say like the average Jewish person,
Hmm.
if they are religious in any way and they celebrate Passover, they generally have a Seder plate,
Yeah.
right? And it has 6 spots,
Yep.
right?
Absolutely.
And one of those is an egg.
Yeah, we grew up with that. We grew up with our grandparents' Seder plate having an egg on it.
Right.
And as a kid, like it was
Mhm.
so confusing
Mhm.
because it was like, well, why is there an egg when I just, I have an Easter egg hunt with my best friend from private school, like in 3 days? Like, why is there an egg
Mhm.
here? And do I get anything special for this
Right.
egg? Because, uh, you know, most eggs had something fun in them. But
Mhm.
no, for Jewish Seder plates, they're just hard boiled.
Right. It's odd that you'd have an egg on the Seder plate when, frankly, there's no reference to it biblically.
Not at all.
There's really no reason for it to be there except from the influence
Hmm.
of Easter over time,
Yeah.
and that's why, like, even in our family, we rarely ever use a Seder plate anymore.
Yeah.
Like, it's just not a thing we do
Yeah.
because it introduces more elements that, although I agree can be symbolic, they're not helpful, right? It
Well,
just adds to the
they're
noise.
good to have if you are recounting the whole story stem to stern from the beginning of Exodus all the way through Exodus 6, 7, and 8 until the children of Israel are all the way out and in the land, like in the wandering. And so, yes, it's really great to, because you have the haroset,
Mhm.
you have the salt water, you have the parsley,
Mhm.
you have the egg, and most of the time people use a bone. Jewish people use a bone instead of
Exactly,
actual
we
lamb.
talked about that.
And crazily enough, I've seen plenty of Seder plates with just a chicken bone
Mhm.
on there
Mhm.
because for whatever reason,
Mhm.
a chicken bone is supposed to be there next to the egg.
Mhm.
And so there is this really strange crossover between the
Yes,
two.
yes, there is, and I think that's really kind of what today's talk is all about, is the origins of Easter being in Passover, but also how Passover has been influenced. And so, what you can recognize is that, by, let's say, um, 300s to 400s,
Hmm.
basically between the Council of Nicaea and the Council of
Laodicea.
Laodicea. One says we're not going to follow the Jewish calendar and we're going to celebrate Easter this, and then the next one says we're going to worship God on Sunday, not
Yep.
Saturday. We're going to separate ourselves from Shabbat,
Yep.
right? And it's going to be because it was about honoring the Lord's Day, and I think that that's kind of at the heart of where this divergence is happening. Is how do people want to observe honoring the Lord? And I think that on one hand, it it is sad to see, but in another, I care that people want to honor the Lord at all,
Yeah.
right? So I don't, want to discourage people if that's how you've grown up in
Yeah.
Easter and there's goodness there, right? It's
Absolutely.
good to
Absolutely.
celebrate the resurrection, and there's some real benefits to doing that in your life, but understanding that historically it was separated because you had one group of people that wanted to focus only on Yeshua's resurrection and his death and what he said and honoring him on the Sunday rather than the Saturday
Yeah.
Shabbat. And so that also was just an outgrowth of the decision to separate from the Jewish calendar, right?
Yeah.
We want to do it when he rose from the dead, right? We
Yeah.
want to honor the Lord's Day on Sunday every week
Yeah.
rather than doing Shabbat rest. And so, it's all about how do we honor what Yeshua did, but interestingly enough, Yeshua is honoring what the Father did.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, that's one of the things that's so interesting is that, you know, people talk about how um if Yeshua was alive today, what would he do? What would he celebrate? How would he behave? What would his decisions be? And we grew up in the WWJD generation. Like I had 14 bracelets all saying, "What would Jesus do?" And the thing that we can't ignore is that Yeshua himself kept the Torah. Yeshua himself said, "I'm not here to abolish the law." And despite the fact that there was this huge divergence, I think that without it, I don't know if it would have gone as far as it did. I don't know if the whole world would have seen the truth of the gospel, because it wasn't until Constantine adopted
Which is shortly after the Council of Nicaea,
right.
right?
So when Constantine adopts Christianity as the national religion, then it becomes this explosion of faith transference, even under, a governmental regulation. And so one of the things that
his edict is one of the main reasons you see the divergence.
Exactly.
Is his edict, I believe, shortly before or after that Council of Nicaea.
Yeah.
He basically says, we're not going to do things the way the Jewish people do. We're going to celebrate it
He
solarly.
adopts it as a Roman institution
Mhm.
instead of a Jewish, way of life. And it really becomes institutionalized. And I think that that's one of the things that in today's culture, we're seeing a lot of people, quote unquote, deconstruct from that institutionalization. And part of that is going back to the origination. So what we're looking to do is trying to look at Easter and Passover in a way that they can work together, and that you can celebrate as we say, the meta narrative, that you can look at the whole story. Because so often, and correct me if I'm wrong, so often we can get really fixated on the miracles that God does for us instead of getting fixated on the hard times that God has brought us through. And I think that Yeshua's death and resurrection really speak to that. And so much of Easter as we know it can get fixated on the miracle of Yeshua's resurrection. Like, let's just be honest, it was miraculous. And it completely turned everything that we know about, salvation into this really full, really beautiful reality. But you can't get to that miracle unless you go through the darkness of the tomb, essentially. And as Jews, Jews don't celebrate the death of Yeshua. What we celebrate is the Passover lamb. And we can see Yeshua, as Messianic Jews, we see Yeshua as the Passover lamb, as the final atonement for all of mankind, and all of humanity, and throughout all time and space. And in so doing, we have a foundation to celebrate the miracle of his resurrection. But without that sacrifice, the resurrection means very little, because it's just it's empty, like the tomb. So in looking at all of this, how did we get Easter celebrations as we know them today?
Well, a lot of it's just cultural appropriation in a way, right? It's just, you have, people become Christian in their own cultures, and then they try to apply some of those earlier, somewhat pagan aspects to their lives now.
Yeah.
Right. That in some ways it just kind of flows over.
Oh yeah.
Right.
For
And
sure.
that's, where you get the Easter egg hunts and you get the chocolate and the, all this stuff kind of occurs over the centuries. And Easter becomes more commercialized, right? Just like Christmas, you
Oh
could
my
say the
gosh,
same thing.
yes.
It just gets more commercialized because people see an opportunity and they want to seize it, right?
Mhm.
Oh goodness, everybody needs eggs. Well, egg production is going to go up, and we're going to make lots of money. That's how same thing with Christmas is the shopping season.
Yep.
So people understand that. Oh, a bunch of people think this is important. We're going to latch onto that.
Yeah.
So it's unfortunate how commercialized it's become, but in some ways, that's just what humanity likes to do.
Yeah, we do. I'll
Um,
be honest.
but the like I said, you've got the kind of the eggs and all that kind of coming later in the 1700s through like German um, culture and whatnot, and chocolate later. And so, Easter starts to drift, just like Christmas drifts. And listen, Christianity is not the only one that does this. Jewish culture,
Absolutely.
the Jewish holidays start to drift because people care more about tradition than they do about the original biblical significance of things.
Mhm.
And so, you have more and more generations accumulate this loss of symbolism as they celebrate it through the generations. And so,
And then a hyper awareness of tradition
mhm,
instead of symbolism.
yeah,
Because the traditions surrounding Passover, the traditions surrounding Yom Kippur, the traditions
mhm,
serving around the
right.
Moedim, the appointed feasts, can become incredibly daunting for anybody who wants to live biblically. So, what is the answer in terms of Passover and Easter? How do we do it biblically? Like, how do
Mm.
we apply both of these celebrations in a biblical fashion?
Well, you alluded to the Yom HaBikurim, or the Day of First Fruits,
Hmm.
which is a biblical concept. And I always remember Dad preaching about him being the first fruits of the resurrection. Right, that was
Yes.
always what Dad would talk about.
Yes.
And
That is a Mark Greenberg
yeah,
101.
he loved that. And it's this idea that all of this is biblically aligned to the Moedim, the appointed times,
Mhm.
and deserves to be celebrated. And I think it really comes down to how you're culturally raised.
Mhm.
That there is great value to a Jewish believer celebrating the resurrection
Mhm.
in a more significant way, right?
Mhm.
More than just Passover,
Yeah.
right? There's also great value to a Christian person who wants to know the origins of the resurrection through the Passover and the Passover Seder,
Right.
right? Both hold great value. Like you said, you've got people from two different perspectives
Mhm.
uh, peering in and looking through a glass dimly,
Yeah.
right?
For
And
sure.
so I think that if during this holiday season, if people can take the time to realize that maybe they only have half the story,
Mhm.
that's well worth it,
Yeah.
in my opinion. It's sad that the divergence happened so long ago, but at least it makes sense. Like, very often we ask ourselves why, like, why
Mhm.
is there such a separation? And you just have to understand that even though bad things happen, the Lord's hand is in it,
Absolutely.
right? And so God knew that if the kingdom was to spread, right, his gospel message, that it would have to go through to the ends of the earth, right?
Absolutely.
And although the Jewish people are the safeguarders of God's word and God's chosen people, it takes a lot more than Jewish people to reach the whole world,
We are
right?
like maybe like
Hmm.
0.5 of
Right,
1% of the human
right.
population on the planet.
Right, and
So, I mean,
Easter is basically the gospel, uh, encapsulated,
mhm.
right? I mean, that's really what it's about, is that, there's a savior that that died for your sins and resurrected, defeated death, and now you can have a relationship with your creator in his kingdom, right?
Mhm.
And you can't have that without the embodiment of what Easter is trying to do.
Yeah.
So I think that's the thing, is like, what's the heart behind Easter? That's the fact that Yeshua died and rose again and defeated death.
Mhm.
That is worth celebrating. All the other stuff that's attached to it, that's been commercialized
Mhm.
and cultural and has pagan origin, yeah, feel free to drop. It's not a problem.
Yeah.
But if things hold significance to you, it's it's worth keeping them if they are biblically based and they point to the Father and the Son.
Yeah, absolutely.
Otherwise, it's just noise. But, I think that often you see people polarize in terms of
Hmm.
they learn this information and they, kind of end up going off the deep end, right? They cut off their family from Christmas and Easter, and they're like, it's all pagan, all this.
Yeah,
And it's not that there isn't some truth to that, but at the end of the day, our ability to have unity and community and the gospel message going forth is far more important than cutting people off. And I think that
absolutely.
that's
A
the
hundred
critical
percent.
piece.
A
So it's,
100%.
you know, I think every Christian person should experience a Passover Seder. I think their eyes
They're
will be
super
opened,
fun. I'll be
right?
honest. We have a good time. I mean, I don't know about you, but pelting, we have a tradition in our family that we want to do things that engage, that's
Hmm.
the word, engage our children.
Hmm.
And we recount the plagues, and
Hmm.
if you don't know where you've come from,
Hmm.
you don't know where you're going.
Right.
And so much of, you know, Yeshua's sacrifice is kind of previewed
Hmm.
in the plagues and previewed in,
Right.
because of course, you talked about, the death of the firstborn and how
Hmm.
Yeshua is the
Hmm.
firstborn of
Hmm.
the Lord and all of these things. And so how it all ties together. And so when we were growing up, our dad would get plastic frogs and pelt them at us, and
Hmm.
we'd get golf ball or ping pong balls, and he'd pretend they were hail, or,
Hmm.
little things to kind of engage each part of the story. And I
Right.
think that,
Well, it's a recounting of the story. That's
yeah,
what Passover is about. It's what's commanded.
yeah,
And I think that
it's
if
commanded that we
you're
remember what happened. Like,
exactly.
tell your children and your children's children and your
Yeah.
children's 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 children
Hmm.
to, like, know what happened.
Hmm.
Because if we don't remember what happened, we won't make good choices in the future. And Proverbs talks all about that.
Well,
So,
it's generational faith transfer is about telling the
absolutely.
stories that matter,
Hmm.
and how God brought your family through the thick of it, right?
Yeah.
And that's what Passover is all about. But if it doesn't end with Yeshua, his death and resurrection, then it's only half the story,
Yes.
right? And I think that's the critical piece is that um, there is a need for an accurate telling of the Passover Seder and the symbolism through time to Yeshua so that people who do celebrate Easter can understand the biblical significance of why they're celebrating
Hmm.
the resurrection. I think often we get caught into celebrating holidays and not really knowing why we're celebrating. We're just glad to have the time off and get to hang out and have good
Yeah,
food.
absolutely.
So I think that it's more about the heart of the matter and whether you can celebrate these holidays knowing what they're about
Yeah.
rather than just seeing a date on the calendar.
Well, I know this is going to sound funny, but there are a lot of families who celebrate Easter. They go to church. They, have the Resurrection Sunday service,
Hmm.
and then they go home and they have a big ham dinner.
Hmm.
And that, as a Jewish believer, it seems so contrary. It seems so out of left field.
Hmm.
But if you don't know the resurrection within the context of Passover, within the context of Pentecost being on Shavuot, if you don't
Hmm.
understand the context in which all of this happened and why it happened that way, then of course you're going to celebrate with, a fattened, instead of a fattened calf, a suckling pig seems appropriate, an appropriate
Hmm.
way to celebrate. And I think that one of the things that I've learned as I've grown up looking at different denominations and different types of expressions of Christianity is that the ones that are more liturgical, the ones that are like Lutherans, Episcopalians,
Hmm.
Anglicans,
Hmm.
the ones who
Hmm.
pay more attention to the, the dates and times,
Hmm.
they actually have special days like Ash Wednesday, like
Hmm.
um, like Good Friday and pay attention to Lent as they go into this season,
Mhm.
where they pay attention to every single marker on the path.
Mhm.
So they pay attention to the going into the Jerusalem. They pay attention to when Yeshua was
Mhm.
sacrificed. They pay attention to how
Right.
long he was in the grave. They pay attention to
Yeah.
how
Yeah, the
much it
Easter
was.
season becomes a reenactment.
And it
Yeah.
becomes something over the course of many, many days. And even in looking at what the ascension is, because as Messianic Jews, we don't celebrate the ascension, but a lot of the mainstream denominations of Christianity do. And so you can't really have a resurrection if he's part of the Godhead without an ascension. So
Mhm.
all of these parts really do play into each other. They are connected. It's a web. And
Mhm.
you
And that's what today's conversation is about, is understanding that they are intrinsically
yeah,
connected.
there's
And
no
you
getting
can't
around it.
you can't really have Easter without Passover. And you
Mhm.
really can't have Passover in its fullness without
Without
the resurrection.
Yep.
So I think that that's the critical component that I hope people get out of today.
Yeah, and I know that as a Messianic Jew, like, we did not grow up celebrating the resurrection the way that our mainstream Christian brothers and
Well, it's
sisters
it's
did.
a main pillar of the Christian calendar, right? It's Christmas and Easter,
Yeah.
right? Those are when it's sort of like Jews and Passover and Yom Kippur,
Yeah.
right? That's what they do. You have different levels of engaged observance,
Mhm.
both in Judaism and Christianity. And the reality is that sometimes those are the only times they see people in church
Yeah.
is for Easter or Christmas, and
Yeah.
so
Gotta
they
get your dose in.
exactly. That it becomes a real outreach opportunity for most Christian churches, and I get that. But if you're talking about discussing the real significance of the time with an average believer, let's say somebody who doesn't know anything about God,
Mhm.
it's hard to do that without the Last Seder, right? The
Mhm.
Last Supper of
Yeah.
Yeshua, and
Don't get me
their
started on the Last
reenactment.
Supper.
And I found it even interesting, like this the Eucharist being basically communion,
Yeah.
which is basically just a Passover Seder,
Yep.
which is like, so it's just like everything is so intrinsically connected. You really can't have one without the other. It's just understanding that there are traditions surrounding both
Mhm.
that don't make a whole lot of sense.
Yeah.
And that's why we do a stripped down Passover Seder most of the time,
Yeah.
because it's just easier to keep track of,
Absolutely.
right? Even the Passover Haggadah
Oh,
is
it's like this thick these days.
it's got way more in it than it needs to.
Mhm.
And so I just want to be careful that hopefully people are watching and not thinking that, it's this is bad or this is good. It's more understanding that we want to follow, what the Lord asks and
Mhm.
requires of us. We want to read our Bible. We want to follow his commandments. We want to be patched into his rhythms
Absolutely.
rather
That's a good way to
than
say that.
just you know adding whatever traditions we want. Traditions are not a bad thing out of hand.
Mhm.
They become distracting
Absolutely.
if they are not tied to something that God has commanded, or something of biblical significance.
Yeah.
I just think it's what happens in culture over time.
And the thing that if I find fascinating is that the New Testament, with Yeshua and the letters from the apostles, um, they don't have any additions to the appointed feasts.
Mhm,
Like there isn't a new Moedim.
mhm,
There isn't a new set of them. There isn't a new bunch of appointed feasts to celebrate Yeshua himself. Our celebration of his death and resurrection is supposed to be within the context of Leviticus 23, because
mhm.
Yeshua himself says, I
Right,
didn't come to abolish the law,
right,
but to fulfill it.
right.
And so the fulfillment therein is by celebrating them, we're also celebrating Yeshua. We're
Mhm,
celebrating
mhm,
his death, his resurrection,
right,
and his salvation of our lives.
right.
And so I
Well,
think,
that's what Yom HaBikurim is supposed to be,
yeah,
right? So in context, Easter is really the celebration of the first fruits and Yeshua, his resurrection being first fruits,
Yeah.
right? Of the risen,
Yeah.
right? So at the end
And
of the
one
day,
day we'll all be part of the risen. I mean, it says so
exactly.
in scripture. How we believe that will happen,
Mm-hmm.
post-trib, pre-trib, and a trib, I don't know. There's a bunch of different ways to do it. But, you know, the reality of Yeshua's existence
Mm-hmm.
inside time and space
Mm-hmm.
is such a miracle in and of itself.
Mm-hmm.
That's why we celebrate his birth. And
Mhm.
even if we, you know, we don't know exactly when that was, the fact that the world celebrates Yeshua's arrival into time and space is a beautiful thing. The fact that the world celebrates Yeshua's death and resurrection, even in some remote way, is still a beautiful thing. It still brings forth the message of the gospel, which is the entire point of the Jewish people. Our entire point of existence is to make the name of Adonai known and to carry his word to the nations and to, you know, quite frankly, just provide some genetic material for the Messiah of the universe. There's nothing more, you know, to us than that. That's just our existence. And so to be able to do that in such a way, even though there is a huge divergence in the early centuries after Yeshua, even though that divergence exists, it doesn't diminish the fact that we we accomplished partially our job, and that we're continuing to do so as people who are ethnically and genetically Jewish, who live as Jews, but also live in the fullness of the New Testament. And I think, like, do you think if you and I had been alive in, let's say, 350 AD, like, what choices do you think we would have made? Like, personally, like, what do you think you would have done? Because if it had been an edict to
Yeah, I think
say,
I think by 350 the decision's been made, at least about Easter, not about Shabbat. Shabbat is done later,
yes,
right? But it is a precursor to understanding that we're not going to do it the way the Jews do.
mm-hmm,
And you really see kind of an anti-Semitic overtone,
yeah.
or I guess undertone, really.
No, it's
To
pretty obvious.
yeah, it's pretty
It's not an
bad.
undertone.
So the Council of Nicaea has that. Also, the edict by Constantine, and then even the Council of Laodicea is the same as well.
Yeah,
The reality is that part of the divergence is because we don't want to do it the Jewish way. We're not under the law. We're not, and those have truth to it, right? Because
yeah,
we have Acts 15 as a template.
yes,
But it doesn't mean that celebrating Passover is important. It doesn't mean that the feasts aren't commanded. And
correct.
it also doesn't mean that God's patterns don't always align
Because God
with
doesn't
the appointed
change. Yeah,
times,
I
right?
mean,
So the reality is, you know, Passover, Yeshua's death, right? Resurrection, Yom HaBikarim, Shavuot, right?
Pentecost.
Pentecost. The fact is God continually works through these patterns.
Mm-hmm.
So divorcing yourself from his appointed times, it blinds you to seeing God moving on the earth.
Well, and that's one of the things that we, really, really press here at the Bible Society is that God has made appointments with humanity.
Mhm.
And there are specially selected time, date stamped things that God wants to draw you in for. And if you have an appointment with the dentist, you're not going to put it off. If you have an appointment to go see your doctor, you're not going to put it off. Or let's just say you get called to the White House, or you get, called up to do something for jury duty. You have to report in. And Jewish people all over the world have to report in. Now, do non-Jewish people need to do it? Not necessarily. According to Acts 15, there's just a few things that you have to keep. But in Yeshua, we all get grafted into that covenant. So
Mhm.
why wouldn't you, if you know where God's going to be, if you know where
Mhm.
his presence is going to be, if you know where he's going to show up, where he has repeatedly done miracles, where his patterns are evident,
Mhm.
why wouldn't you arrive?
Mhm.
Why wouldn't
Mhm.
you get to the
Right,
destination?
you're just benching yourself in a sense.
Yeah.
And so I think that's really, I think, what we try to stress when we do kind of compare and contrast, I
Hmm.
guess you would say, uh, Jewish holidays, Christian holidays, Jewish observance, Christian observance, because they're intrinsically connected. You
Absolutely.
really can't separate the two.
No
But
matter how much people have
yeah, people
tried.
really do try. And there is some serious value to, I think, looking across the aisle and seeing God's creation trying to worship him,
Hmm.
right? I mean, you could say the same thing about the divergence of Shabbat and Sunday worship, right?
Yeah.
The Jews were commanded to keep Shabbat holy,
Hmm.
right? And to honor the seventh day because that's when God rested. Christians wanted to honor the Lord's Day and his resurrection every week. And so they switched to a Sunday worship.
Yeah.
Both have great value,
Absolutely.
right? Listen, honoring the Lord, um, taking the time to meditate on his precepts, worship him, these are good habits to have.
100%.
What's sad is when ego and control and power get in the way of people being inclusive,
Hmm.
and doing our best to realize we're all worshiping the same creator,
Absolutely.
right? And so you know you look in the past and you say, well, that makes more sense,
Yeah.
right? But does that change how you necessarily do things today? Not really. What it does is it informs you to be more understanding,
Hmm.
more loving, more caring, and hopefully more inviting and welcoming.
Yeah.
I think we really struggle with hospitality in this era,
Yeah.
right? That especially post COVID, people really struggle with just being hospitable and welcoming, and a lot of the feasts are all about that,
Yeah. I
and
was just about to
Easter and
say,
Christmases too, right?
yeah, I was just about to say that part of the Passover celebration and part of what's ordered in scripture is to not turn anyone away and
Exactly.
to welcome anyone to the table. And that's one of the things that we really want to
Yeah.
excel at in
Mhm.
this next generation is to
Yeah.
say, come to the table. Just
Mhm.
come to the Passover table, come to the Seder table, come to
Right.
the Last Supper table.
Mhm.
It will
Yeah.
definitely not look like Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper.
Mhm.
There will not be lobster and
Mhm.
leavened bread.
Mhm.
God bless you, but that's not going to happen if you come to my
Mhm.
house. But you are more than welcome, regardless, because
Mhm.
the same God of the universe who established his people,
Mhm.
whose glory sat on Mount Sinai, that rose Yeshua from the dead, that that is the same God we serve today. And you can
Mhm.
find him at our Seder plate,
Mhm.
and you can find him in our celebrations. And so biblically, um, you know, we have ways that we've celebrated Passover and
Mhm.
into the resurrection. So I can't
Mhm.
wait to talk about those in the after show. We'll
Mhm.
share some of our little tricks and
Oh
tips
yeah.
for
Oh yeah.
celebrating these things
Oh yeah.
because I don't know about you, but my kids are kind of obsessed with the idea of an Easter bunny, and I think we can talk about that in the after show, how to navigate that one.
Oh yeah, that's a tough one. Intermarriage and cultures in families and all trying to follow the Lord, and what do you celebrate and what you don't. That's definitely a conversation worth having. So
Yeah.
with that, we'll pray and end our little
Take it away,
get together
Joe.
today.
This
But
has been super informative. Thank you
oh
so
yeah,
much.
yeah, it's all good. Dear Lord, thank you for today, and thank you for your Passover lamb,
Mm,
Lord, that Yeshua died and that he resurrected
mm.
on the third day, Lord, and that he's now seated at the right hand of the Father,
Yes, Lord.
interceding for us day in and day out, Lord.
Yes.
And so we want to honor you in everything we do, Lord, not just on specific days, not just when you command, Lord, but that everything we do would be offered up as incense
Yes.
to you, Lord, that we would emulate our Messiah, God, that we would honor you in our actions and in our speech, and that we would hopefully exude the fruit of the Spirit in a way that brings your kingdom closer, Lord, and tells the goodness of the gospel to those around us.
Yes.
So thank you, God, and I just thank you that you are good and your mercy endures forever. In Yeshua's name, amen.
Amen.
Thanks for joining us.
Shalom, thank you for joining us. We had such a wonderful time sharing the Bible with you today. I have been a tither my whole life. I have given to the kingdom of God in a myriad of ways, in a myriad of places. But let me tell you where I've always seen a return on my investment. When you sow into the Word of God, being proclaimed, being taught, being shared, being read, being seen, being sung, that's the way that we're going to change the world. So I encourage you today to consider giving a gift to the Tree of Life Bible Society. A one-time gift would be such a blessing. A monthly gift so that we can get Bibles into the hands of families, children, teachers of the Word. We want to make sure that the Bible, the literacy through Bible study, is what's going to turn our country back to God. And I'd like you to be a part of that. So please consider giving to the TLV Bible Society today.